in these kind of metaphorical, mathematical terms. And after he died, he appeared to me in a dream. I'm not a mystic, so this is my own imagination working or whatever, but it felt incredibly like his presence was in the room. It was dark, and in this dream, he told me that he was setting my alarm clock to infinity. And now that it was set to infinity, I had the magic power and that I could divide by 0, so long as I did it in the darkness, and that everybody else had to wait until they were on the other side of the veil to be able to achieve that. So like when you grow up with math in this kind of other way that's not focused on test results and not focused on adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing, there's a way that you start looking at the world where you see what I'm going to call the poetry of mathematics and a lot of things in a lot of places where other people don't see that poetry. So how are we doing with that? Oh, we're there.
Yep.
All right. I didn't even realize you made that much progress. How do I get it?
So if you just speak to Craig, then Craig will is showing his screen and he'll be able to
Craig,
move
thank
through the
you.
slides.
All right.
Oh,
What would on Mac would be Control O, so it's 1 page per screen. Perfect. So this is, I am a book artist and I do drawings and sculptures. This is one of my mathematical drawings. I don't always draw in a mathematical manner, but this is a Warnoy partition pattern with watercolor and ink. And I'm not going to talk about it too much. Next image. Thanks, Craig. So nice to see your face. This is the Baromian Rings I was talking about. Now let's just stop here for a minute. If you look at any 2 of these rings, and it's a little hard to do, but you see this one goes over that one and over that one. So if it weren't for the 3rd one, it would fall apart. But that's true for each pair of rings. They're not connected. The 3 of them are connected. And that is why this mathematical artifact is basically the perfect symbol for a Holy Trinity. You missed the paperclip demonstration, Craig, but when you're back here, I'll show you. Next image, please. That's the trefoil knot, and you can see that's just one continuous path, which also has spiritual metaphors. Next image, please. This is my dad's last page of his last notebook. He spent his whole life writing in his notebooks. So mathematicians will recognize it, but basically he's thinking about non-existence and infinity, and he at this point he knows he's dying. Next image, please. So John Conway, does anybody recognize what this image is? This is an image from something called The Game of Life. So this example is from about 1970. And John Conway was a mathematician who took the late work of Alan Turing on biomorphogenesis, or the mathematical origins of the forms of life, and developed it into this game that has 3 extremely simple rules. Any square cell, can you scroll up so I can see those rules? Any square cells that has 2 neighbors or 3 neighbors lives to the next generation. Any cell that's alone dies, but any cell that has more than 3 neighbors dies as if by overcrowding. And so what happens is, with this, as simple as the rules are, depending on the starting pattern, you get patterns that can change continuously, grow and spread in a very irregular fashion. Or there's also patterns that are stable and do what you would call oscillate. Some oscillate in 1 or 2 generations, some oscillate in longer generations. And then there's patterns that oscillate, but they move in one direction. So they oscillate, some die, some live, but every few generations or every other generation, the pattern repeats itself, but they migrate. as they oscillate. And then there's patterns that are called guns. And they're like little things that chase themselves across, if you know, this, it's like that's a map, and those are populations. And these patterns, as random as that appears, I mean, it's not particularly beautiful or even orderly, actually mimic patterns that you would see if you could put ink on the hooves of elves. Do elves have hooves? Yes, okay. You know, ink on the hooves of deers, ink on the hooves of wolves, and track where they were at different times. This game of life revolutionized how living things and biological things were modeled. And it was the first digital modeling of that. Next image, please. This is like my favorite image in the whole thing. And like, I get happy every time I see it. It's so beautiful. So this is Alan Turing, who's a mathematician, not an artist. After he's so famous for the Enigma machine, and I don't know how many of you saw the movie where he cracked the code and saved millions of lives in World War II, and later on was shamed for being homosexual, but additionally he was professionally shamed because the last 8 years of his life he spent trying to understand the principles of biological form. And so he was looking at flowers, he was looking at things like this. This is a hyperbolic surface, and the rule, it's a complicated form, complicated surface, but the rule for it is you crochet 6, increase 1, crochet 6, increase 1, crochet 6, increase 1. I won't keep going, don't worry. But you get the idea. And it starts out almost cylindrical, and then it starts to turn. And then you get this incredible non-flat surface. This is how flowers are formed. This is how coral is formed. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but just very simple rules, but they're iterated over and over again. And they produce a vast array of surprisingly complicated results with very, very simple principles. And if anyone wants to pass this around, it's sort of fun to look at. Okay, next image, please.
So Sarah, what was he suggesting in that Turing slide?
So this is a sketch from his notebook. And in this particular sketch, this is not a published paper. He is literally looking at the head of a flower.
Okay.
And writing little numbers, and there's quite a few. This is phyllotaxid, so a lot of things like pine cones or seed heads. If you look at them, you can see that there's spirals in one direction and there's spirals in another direction, but they're not always the same number of spirals. It's usually something in this Fibonacci sequence, like 3 and 5, 5 and 8, 8 and 13. But I feel like that's another talk. But is that, yeah.
Yeah.
So, just an example of, you know, here's this homosexual mathematician looking at flowers, and his work was so disregarded, but his unpublished notes were preserved at Cambridge. And John Conway, who was a friend of my father's, was talking about this in my kitchen when I was 12 about Turing's beautiful notebooks. Next image, please. So this is another sketch by Turing. This is him talking about two things reacting to each other. So two things reacting to each other. Let's go back to lions and antelopes on a plane. Antelopes want to be together. A lion jumps into the middle of them. They run away. Then the lions leave. The antelopes want to be together and they group. So there's these constantly changing patterns of spots and groupings. And he's, it's it's a non-linear type of math that is very hard to do. And when he was doing it, nobody took it seriously, but now these types of reaction diffusion equations are used to make natural looking patterns in animation, to study how medicine is distributed through patches, because there's, you know, diffusion through membranes and other things like that. These sketches, which were unpublished in his lifetime, were used by other mathematicians later to really revolutionize, you know, our understanding of biology. Next, please. Thank you, Craig. So these patterns are very, very trendy now. These are Warnoy partition patterns. And the way they're formed is you take any random distribution of dots. There's more than one way to form them, but let's just start. Random distribution of dots, and I'm just going to do 3 for speed. And they grow, and they grow, and they grow, and then they start hitting each other, and they change shape, right? And you get a whole pattern. Like if they're close together, you have little cells. If they're far apart, you have bigger cells. And these patterns are all over nature. So you see them in dragonfly wings, you see them in corn cobs, you see them in the wrinkles of your hand. And a lot has been done with contemporary art. Yeah, let's go ahead. Next image. So this is a concrete screen made by CBL architectural firm. The Warnoy patterns are an engineering phenomenon because they can be incredibly light and use a minimal amount of material and still be unbelievably strong. That's a concrete screen, and that is just for visual comparison, a pattern of a giraffe's coat. Thank you, Craig. Next, please. Dragonfly wing, familiar image, we can scroll on by. Here is an example of biomimicry in architecture. This is, trying to remember the name of it. There we go, the parametric house. So these patterns are both decorative and structural. And there's a big movement in architecture to get away from the classic modernist box and have more light, more air, more of a natural feel to the building. They're finding that people feel happier when they don't feel boxed in, and when you're in a space that has this kind of structure, you feel like you're in a environment rather than a cubicle. Next image, please.
Sorry, and just a reminder to those on Zoom, please mute if you could, so background noise doesn't come into the room. Sorry, everyone should mute except for the fireside room. I apologize. So Sarah, unmute the fireside room. We definitely need to hear you. However, everyone else on the Zoom, please mute for now.
Thank you, Craig, I got it. So this is an architect who trained at MIT, where they're very into math and engineering combined with architecture. I think it's just a beautiful surface. Next. This is a fashion designer who uses biomimicry for, you know, cells, insect eyes, Warnoy patterns, and she makes these dresses. I think aspects of them are 3D printed, and they're quite phenomenal. Next. Here's another architect out of MIT, Thomas, I think it's Sarceno, but it might be Sarceno, who looks at spider webs and brambles in nature. And this is more art architecture than something that is structural or a living environment. Next, please. This is a drawing by a mathematical friend of mine. don't think these are Warnoy. This is some kind of lattice. I'd have to ask her, but it's an artist book that she calls Lace Trap, and it's actually mathematical lace. And it's just another example of biomimicry, because these types of porous matrices exist in sea creatures and other biological forms. Next, please. This is an artist who never trained as a mathematician. This drawing's from 1963 when she was really quite young. I don't even know if she was 20 yet. But she's dealing with this idea of infinity. And it's like an intuitive approach to some of the things that the mathematicians and the biologists are approaching through science and math. So we're going to fast forward 46 years now to the next image. She spent her whole lifetime thinking about infinity. So this is the infinity room that was installed in the Hirshhorn. It's a room maybe half the size of this one, but the ceilings, the floors, and all four walls are mirrors. And then she hung these strings of lanterns. And the mirrors, like people would freak out when they stepped into the room. They had to put handrails in because people would get dizzy, because you step into the room and you're looking down the mirror and it doesn't look 500 or 5,000 feet deep. It literally looks like you would fall forever into open space. And so she again, there's no mathematical training here, but the idea of infinity or the unknown to me is something that's it's fearsome. And some people address their fear of the infinity and the unknown through the arts, some through math and science, and some through religion. But this kind of space that is so vast that it goes into 19th century notions of sublime. She's grappling with it in terms of visual art. 46 years on the same topic. So she's an astonishing artist. Next slide, please, Craig. Thank you. This is a project that I worked on, and I'm going to go back to this idea of iteration. I was lucky enough to work on it. I had no role in designing it. We can forward to the final result, which is the next image. So that's the completed thing. So there was this mathematician who designed this form to be built out of Zoom tools. And to complete it, his design would require, I think it was 250,000 pieces or more. And after he designed it, he died of AIDS. And his partner wrote to the Bridges Conference director and asked if we could collectively, while we're attending the conference, assemble this design in honor of his dead partner. So Zoom, the producers of the Zoom toy, gave us like the pieces it cost. And about 45 people over the course of 5 days. Each of us was given a teeny tiny little thing to repeat, like one little hexagon or one little cylinder here. And they would pile up. This is my cue to stop talking about math and start tying it to faith and practice. So tiny little, very simple things are repeated over and over again. And they produce this beautiful, complicated result. It was 8 feet high and I think 14 feet wide. Next slide. I'm doing well because this is kind of where I wanted to be. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with CRISPR technology, which is gene splicing. It's kind of not artistic or poetic or metaphor. It's really getting in there and messing with the actual DNA of living creatures. And there's no living creature that cannot be modified. They're not going all the way, and cloning also I think is possible and very problematic. but this technology allows a very precise sequence of DNA to be cut out of one side, replaced with a very slight modification. And the results of this technology can be miraculous. It can heal inherited conditions, especially blood conditions like sickle cell anemia. Instead of just curing or maintaining it, they go in there and they edit, and then the edit is reproduced over and over again, and the condition actually goes away. But the moral and ethical considerations are just enormous. And I'll just leave it at that. Next slide. This is, I'm gonna just leave this here because I'm going to coral reef. Besides the creative, poetic, and metaphorical things of biomimicry, there's actual biomimicry. And one of the big projects of biomimicry is to save the coral reefs. And what they're finding is that, 20 years ago, they were dumping tires, hoping that the sea creatures would reestablish themselves in the crevices and things like that. And it wasn't really working. Tires degraded and their skeletons weren't thick enough to hold up their own weight. And it resulted, all these ecosystems underwater are crashing. Next image, please. So there's this movement to create materials that are less harmful. And this New Heaven Coral Aid Project, and there's another firm in California, there's another one in Connecticut, are trying to develop concrete that doesn't harm the underwater world. And next image, please. This is an astonishing thing. So they've made this gigantic concrete form and sunk it where the coral reef was failing, and then put all this metal. Metal is apparently not that harmful, and the sea creatures are starting to attach themselves and restore a damaged environment. So, and let's just scroll through the end of my. I just have a couple images of my. This is one of my artist books. It's an aluminum book, and on the inside, scroll forward one more, thanks. On the inside is a fractal folding, so that's like a folding that was actually designed by a mathematician, and the text is about Cassandra. Now we can just rest on the final image, so the next image is the last image. So in daily life, I still have a little time. In daily life, the idea of little tiny changes repeated often, making an enormous difference. I'm going to tell a personal narrative. I carry a lot of anger. I wake up every morning, I'm angry. I wake up, I'm angry. I have to write a note on the top of my computer, no comments before coffee. I have a lot of hostility, which for reasons that I don't go into. And one of the main reasons that I come into church is because singing makes me feel better, and thinking about forgiveness makes me feel better. And for me, forgiveness was not something that I could decide to do and then a switch went off. Okay, I forgive my grandpa. Okay, I forgive my ex-husband. Okay, I have to work at it. And so my little changes include things like when I drive, if I'm keyed up, it can really come out in me just not having patience for four-way stop signs. I'm like, it's on the floor, just go. You don't have to prove your right. I'm sitting there, I'm like, it's on the floor. Oh my God, Minnesota drivers, they're like, you go first. I'm like, no, you go first, you go first. And if I'm good, if I'm happy and I'm centered, I'm not in that state while I'm driving, but I'm not always happy and centered. And so when I start to get that buildup of anger, the practice of going to church and asking for forgiveness and saying that prayer each week really helps to balance that
and other things, like when somebody comes at me with a lot of aggression, I have a little mantra that I repeat. And the mantra is, that's their negativity. I don't have to let it be my negativity. I want to go Brooklyn. I'm like not as sweet and nice. I believe in being kindness. I believe in being empathetic, but I have to own that my own nature is a little bit more of like a warrior tiger. I would rather just be like, just shut up, you know, than really the kindness and the steadfast non-reactivity that I see in some of my wonderful friends and some of the amazing people here. I'm working on it, but I have to work on it. I have to work on it every single week. And if things are good, it's kind of easy, pleasant work, and I show up and I sing and I go to the coffee hour. But if things are bad, just that act of saying, forgive me, learning to forgive others, and repeating that little act of just stopping and reflecting on what it is I'm carrying, what it is I need to let go of, and not letting other people's negativities become my negativities. These things affect out, because you don't know what person who's not driving well has just lost someone they love, or just found out somebody they love has cancer, or if you shout at somebody because they're not like going fast enough, you could really hurt a sensitive person's feelings, or you could even cause a car accident. And similarly, if you're in the driver's seat and you're a parent and you have your little kids in the back and you're going like, learn to drive, it's on the floor. Oh my God, Minnesotans can't park, or whatever it is. Like, it doesn't matter what state I'm in. I'm not like prejudiced against Minnesotans. New Yorkers can't drive either. You know, it's not specific, but like just being in that state of anger isn't just negative for me. It's negative for everyone I know if I don't address it. And that's like a personal narrative, but there's other more poetical things like planting a tree each year. In 30 years, you have a forest. It's overwhelming to plant a forest, but it's not overwhelming to plant a tree each year. So this idea of little steps, very, very little steps that are extremely achievable, but repeated hundreds or thousands of times. I think there's a correlation between that and the lessons from Turing and biomimicry. And that's where I land.
Sarah, when you say it's on the floor, are you talking about the gas?
Yes.
Go for it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
You know, one thing that I regret when you talked about how you learn like arithmetic, I didn't like algebra and I felt really stupid trying to do it. And at Blake, we had an option to take a class called the Art of Math. And I just thought, in comparison to what is able to offer at a lot of public high schools, it was, I sat in on the course quite a bit. It was a revelation to see math that way, instead of just these numbers that just didn't come together. And so you were lucky to be immersed in that as a kid and not to have it opened up like that. With the Alan Turing story, one thing, and it doesn't quite relate, but little comment, that evidently when Apple was invented, somebody asked Steve Jobs, because Alan Turing took his life with a poisoned apple, and did you name Apple after Turing with it? And Steve Jobs said no, but God, I wish we had. So I just thought that was a nice postscript to his life.
Yes. He was very brilliant. Like, I don't understand the equations. And I was telling Piria that whose native language is not English, that even I don't understand all of what I'm showing you. I can name it and I can see it, but I cannot explain it in mathematical terms. No, there's always more to be learned with these things.
There's a corollary, verbally, there's a quotation by someone, a novelist, I forget who, that said, don't judge what I know by what I have words for.
Thank you. That's lovely. Thank you. I love that. Does anybody have any?
I wonder, Sarah, could you comment on something of the kind of big picture implications of mathematics and their ability to describe the world? And what I have in mind is, any number of contemporary ways of thinking will say that, we human beings kind of concoct our own ideas, and the extent to which those ideas map onto reality, capital R reality, is highly questionable according to many of these ways of thinking. But mathematics puts a challenge before that pure constructivist stance, right? There's an extraordinary way in which the explorations conducted through mathematics seem to, time and time again, tap into some structure of reality, right? So it's not mathematicians kind of musing, doing their own things with no correlation to the real.
Mhm.
It's, in any number of instances, actually getting at something, some fundamental features of the world. That says something really, really interesting with far-reaching implications about human intellection and its ability to describe reality. And the fact that there is that connection is an extraordinary thing. Right?
There's
It says something about the
extraordinary
intelligibility of the universe and our ability to tap into that intelligibility. So any thoughts about that?
Yes, so both math and religion are trying to give some order, a sense to these immense, enormous, sublime things that we feel are true but can't prove are true. Any mathematical system needs a meta system to actually prove it, because it all comes down to the beginning of a few axioms which actually can't be proven. You just have to accept that they exist. But my favorite thing to think about is when you see a picture of atoms in school, I'm not going to draw it. The nucleus is here, and then they draw the other little particles like this, but that's not the reality at all. The reality is that if we had a head of a pin in the middle of a room, the nearest other particle would be a mile away, and I dated a mathematician, and I'm such a nerd, it's just incredible. That means that literally 13 circles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. That's how much empty space we are. That's our percentage of empty space. We are so empty. So, and I don't mean that we're soulless or anything like that, but we literally are more energy and connection than we are physical matter. And so the mystery or the arrogance of pretending we know anything for sure is kind of astonishing. And Buddhist thought talked about this, emptiness in terms of lack of desire or lack of this, but like, that's hard to understand. That is so counter to all of our, what we see, what we feel, what we stand on. I mean, if we walked around thinking about that, we would just like fall down in a puddle of confusion. So math reveals these mysteries of existence. And I also think the religious experience does the same thing, in a different way, that there's things that are talked about, near-death experiences, experiencing the Holy Spirit, experiencing these transformative feelings that you read about it across religion. It doesn't make sense in terms of math and science, but I think to dismiss it as irrational when it's so universally experienced is actually also not scientific, but it's all a question of fighting this feeling of immense powerlessness and our own demise and trying to make sense of it in either mathematical terms like my father did or in spiritual terms like religions help us to do. Is that a good answer? I have to sing. So I have like maybe one more question and then I'll have to go sing. Is there a question? Oh, Craig, you have to unmute yourself.
Hey, apologies for the technological gremlins, and thank you for your grace, Sarah, and your beautiful presentation. I just wanted to thank you for bringing in the idea of repetitions, the idea of the discipline of a spiritual life that is repeated week after week, day after day, sometimes hour after hour. It connects with something I've learned here. Henry Nouwen, his last work about 3 movements in the spiritual life, which moves us from isolation to solitude in the first movement, from hostility to hospitality in the second movement, and then from illusions about God and ourselves based on ego projections, moving from illusions to prayer or a real communion with all that is seen and unseen in creation. And thank you for saying that mathematics really is a spiritual practice. It's an art. It's something that we have to do every day for these small fractals to have huge cultural implications, because they do. Salman Rushdie talked a lot about, we're like onions and garlic, that when you fuse these things into each other, they flavor the lives of other people that we come into contact with. So I think, yes, if we continue these daily disciplines, these weekly disciplines as mathematicians with some real intention, it can actually change the people in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our church, in our state and in the world. So thank you for saying that. I don't really have a question, but other than that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
It's actually an honor to be asked.
I'm so glad you said yes.
I really am grateful. I'm grateful for all the kindness. I'm a very imperfect Christian and no one has ever judged the year. Even when I like freaked out once or twice, which I have, it's just been the most wonderful experience. If I had known what SJE was like, I would have moved to St. Paul just for SJE. So I'm very grateful to all of you.
I wanted to say that these 4 presentations, 2 on the birds, 1 on engineering, and yours on art, have been among the best I've ever heard, and I've been in the church like for 400 years. And the idea that that our religious faith is reflected in some of these patterns is overwhelming. I remember what Don Weinkauf said last week. One of the things is that he said that in terms of mathematical or engineering discoveries, that often there's even a saying, a formula or something that says this, that when the mathematicians or the engineers make these discoveries and get to this point, they find the theologians and philosophers have said, what took you so long? That they were there all along. And so for me, it's the idea of trusting the endpoint and then trying to fill in the blank as I live. But it's just been a terrific series in terms of the whole idea of biomimicry is inspired anyway, I think. But thank you very much. It was just terrific.
Thank you. I have to run downstairs and sing.
Let's express our thanks to Sarah.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Sarah. We will be taking a break from Sunday Faith Forums for the summer months, but please come back in September. The Faith Formation Commission will be spending June, July, and August curating all of the programming coming up. So I'd like to just thank everyone for turning up on Zoom and turning up in the fireside room. And Mark, is there any other housekeeping that you'd like to do?
No, that is it.
Okay. Thank you all. We'll see you in worship. At least I'll be on YouTube. But blessings to you this week. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Jay.